Joining me on India First is Air Marshal Anil Khosla, former Vice Chief of Air Staff. Glenn Carl, former officer in the CIA's Director of Operations, will join us in just a moment. Sushant Sarin is Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, keeps a hawk-eye on developments in Pakistan. Also joining me on this broadcast is Sandeep Punithan, Senior Journalist. And let me begin by asking you, Sandeep, does the devil lie in the detail? Russia launching its nuclear submarine designed to carry this underwater nuclear drone known as this doomsday missile. Are America and Russia now locked in a nuclear arms race?
Well, absolutely, Gaurav. The 2025 is in that sense a watershed year because this is the first time since the end of the Cold War in 1991 that we're seeing so much of activity related to nuclear weapons. And Russia has just launched this new submarine, the Khabarovsk, which is a Poseidon missile carrier, a Poseidon torpedo carrier. And that is a completely new class of weapons. I mean, you have your traditional triad of nuclear weapons, which is land, sea, and air-launched weapons. And this is a completely new type of weapon. This is a very large underwater torpedo, which is a nuclear-powered. It's a nuclear-powered torpedo. It carries a massive, several megaton warhead, which is capable of, as the Russians claim, inundating entire cities with that blast wave. So it's a completely new type of weapon system that Russia has fielded. Of course, they've been developing it over the last decade, and they say it's in response to the U.S. anti-ballistic, pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. But Gaurav, the other important thing is that this year is probably the first time you just saw that massive parade that China had in September, where they displayed their triad of nuclear weapons, all capable of hitting the United States. This is the first time in history that you're seeing three nuclear powers not friendly towards the United States. That is North Korea, China, and the Russian Federation. All of them having nuclear weapons capable of targeting the United States. So a lot of the rhetoric that you see coming out of the US from what President Trump just said has to do with this fact that you're looking at a very new kind of arms race where a large number of countries now have the weapon systems, the delivery platforms, and new types of nuclear-tipped missiles, underwater nuclear torpedoes capable of targeting the United States. So it's a very,
so let me bring in Glenn Carl into this conversation. Glenn Carl, is this posturing by President Trump? First saying US will carry out a nuclear test, and now Energy Secretary Chris Wright clarifying, saying that the planned tests will be of non-critical nature and there will be no nuclear explosion?
I think that's accurate. I mean, it's posturing in the sense that all diplomatic statements and moves are posturing. All of this is, it is all signaling. And in this instance, critic as I am of Donald Trump, I don't want to imply that that is denigrating what he's done. So yes, it is posturing. I don't believe, however, that the U.S. will conduct nuclear explosions at this point. I mean, various officials have said, no, this is just going to be testing of the various components. And it is, or as my predecessor just said very accurately, these are responses by the United States to a substantially changed and changing international environment with regard to nuclear powers.
Okay. Air Marshal Khosla, President Trump said words to the effect that countries like Pakistan, China, Russia, North Korea, they carry out tests, but since they aren't an open society, since they're not democracies, perhaps that information does not come out in public domain. Is that even possible in today's day and age, given the satellites and given that every seismic activity is very closely monitored across the world?
Yeah, Gaurav, the clarification by the Energy Minister, the Chris Wright, gives a hint to that. See, what is happening is when the nuclear weapons were being developed, enough testing went on. For example, United States itself from 1945 to 1992 carried out 1,054 tests. That amounts to almost 2 a month. That kind of testing went on. I mean, so did the other country, other nuclear power. So the development of the weapon as such is complete. But what is happening is with the new technologies coming in, the delivery systems are changing, like rightly brought out, new dimension has been added underwater, besides land, air, and sea. And also the warheads and the weapons are improving, like MIRV is coming in, where
MIRV.
multiple targets can be engaged with a missile. So to test these in the nuclear domain, these tests, I think, are being carried out in a subcritical way, which they are talking about, not a mushroom over Nevada, but tests are being conducted. That is what is happening. So that is why these seismic activities may not be there, but these tests
Okay.
are going on.
Sushant, Sarin, is there merit in some reports from Pakistan that the nukes from the time of General Pervez Musharraf, since early 2000s, were actually either monitored or controlled by the United States of America? Can Pakistan conduct tests and US president not know about it? Because satellites or seismic activity, they're all monitored very closely.
Gaurav, I don't think they can carry out tests unless, of course, there's a similar subcritical level of tests. I don't think they can carry out an underground nuclear explosion and not be found out. Maybe it's possible in China, given the vast land space, maybe in Russia, but in Pakistan, certainly not. I don't see that happening. Second, I'm a little skeptical about these reports about the Americans having control over Pakistani nukes. I would imagine that when questions were raised about the safety of Pakistani nukes, the Pakistanis were cooperating with the Americans to, ensure that the security of their nuclear weapons. But would they have handed over control of those weapons to the Americans? I seriously doubt it. You remember, I think in the last week or last 2 weeks of the Biden administration, there was a testimony given in Congress where one of the senior officials had claimed that there are serious concerns over Pakistan developing missiles which could reach the United States, and given its
ICBMs,
nuclear weapons
yes.
status, it constitutes a threat to the US. So there are concerns, certainly in the US, about the Pakistani nuclear program, but whether they have control of it, if they had control, why would they be so concerned about the Pakistani missile reach? And finally, there is certainly a lot of reports that have come out in the past that the Pakistanis have what is supposedly the fastest growing nuclear weapons program. How many warheads they have is at best an estimate, perhaps reasonably accurate, but they have been going hell for leather in getting nukes. Now, I don't know if they've had to test something and the Americans know something that we don't know, but I don't think they've carried out any underground test. In any
Okay,
case, when Donald Trump talks, he's not very precise in what he's saying. He's
true.
saying something, but it's not something which is very carefully thought out, carefully worded. He just lets it out there, and then, the whole world goes into a bit of a tizzy trying to figure out what the hell is he trying to say. Does he mean what he's saying? Is he saying what he means? So that's another problem, and, your
But
guess
we
is
are
as
looking at an arms race already, Daniel Silverberg, aren't we? Your understanding of this Russian nuclear submarine and underwater nuclear drone, and President Trump talking about keeping up with other nuclear powers. Are we looking at deadlier weapons, deadlier delivery mechanism? Air Marshal Khosla was talking about the multiple independent re-entry vehicles, so one missile dropping multiple nuclear warheads.
Gaurav, it's good to be with you again. Frankly, I am not buying the hyperbolic statements around this. I don't think that there's anything different today than what was happening yesterday. Experts know that Russia has been pursuing all kinds of various novel nuclear technologies. The same thing with China. The only thing that's new today is that President Trump said something offhanded, and as the previous guest rightly observed, was likely off the cuff, imprecise, and utterly unclear what he meant. I feel pretty confident saying that he did not mean that there's going to be a resumption of nuclear tests in the Nevada desert. It's logistically challenging. It really makes no sense to do it. and frankly, it's out of step with what is U.S. nuclear posture. Now, what often happens when President Trump says something, and it's important to understand the effect in Washington, when President Trump says something offhanded, it then creates its own weather system of activity. The Pentagon then has to respond and explain, well, what kind of tests are we doing? And then Secretary Wright needs to explain, well, it's not exactly an actual explosion, it's merely an ongoing test. The bottom line is, don't pay attention just yet to Trump rhetoric, as so many of his own officials say, watch what he actually does. I feel pretty confident that there's not going to be a nuclear test, and there is not a significant change in the nuclear posture among China, Russia, and the US.
Okay. Though the timing, the first time he said it just moments before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and then he reiterates it a couple of days later in his interaction with the American media, then on board. Sandeep, reports now in the USA, you heard Chris Wright speak to the American media where he said that these are subcritical experiments, perhaps avoid the nuclear chain reaction, test the delivery mechanism, test components, but no detonation of a nuclear warhead. But Sandeep, could this then set off a chain reaction? Will Russia carry out, tests in retaliation or response? Or is America doing this in response and then it is a vicious cycle?
Well, Gaurav, the United States doesn't really need to test new weapons. I mean, if they were to do that, they would only test it as a thing of political signaling, because they have, like you mentioned, more than 1,000 tests. There's enough data to, create several generations of new nuclear weapons. So the United States doesn't really need to test new weapons, unlike, say, many of the other, potential nuclear weapon states, or those with smaller arsenals who want to, test new types of, thermonuclear weapons or something like that. But the US will only have to test if it has to send out a political message, a political signal of that sort. And what the US officials then came back to correct what the president said is something that the US has been doing for decades now, ever since it stopped testing. All of the subcritical testing has been going on for several decades. The US has one of the most advanced nuclear arsenals in the world. The kind of miniaturization that the US has achieved with its nuclear arsenal is the envy of every other nuclear weapon state. And that is the reason why the statements that it comes from a position of strength. But I mean, of course, you're looking at the rhetoric around this, where you have multiple countries now which threaten the United States, and they are signaling. So it is quite possible that they would test before the United States does. Like, I'm talking of countries like North Korea, for instance, the Russian Federation, which is involved in a very, long war of attrition in Ukraine. That has, and Russia has actually come closer to testing a weapon, in fact, in the battlefield, than has any other country in the recent past.
So is that the signal? Is that the signal, Marshal Khosla, which could trigger an arms race? And, in the India-Pakistan context, with Pakistan working on the tactical nuclear weapons, and as Sushant Sarin was also pointing out, Pakistan is adding numbers to its nuclear arsenal at a very fast pace, as is China. 100 warheads every year since 2023 is the assessment. Your assessment, sir, of the capabilities of our neighbours, Pakistan and China, and the road ahead. Is there any lesson here for India?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we are facing two nuclear-powered adversaries on both the sides. And China, as covered earlier, is racing with the USA. And if you see, interesting part is that China has never been part of any of the arms control deals which have been taking place in earlier. Their stance has been that, it's a discrimination between haves and have-nots. And let's, once we get that have status, then we will talk to you. Then we'll sit on the table and talk about, arms control and whatever. So that is where China is. As far as Pakistan is concerned, obviously, China, when it rises, Pakistan will benefit. But the worrying part of Pakistan is, the saber rattling which it does. All these years, he's been holding the nuclear saber in one hand and doing terrorism, the acts of terrorism on the other, which the myth has been broken now with Balakot and Op Sindoor. But, there's a cause of worry. One is this nuclear saber rattling. Other issue, a small issue which you brought out, you mentioned the tactical nuclear weapons. This term has come in lexicons of all the defense analysts. I don't understand what is tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. If you throw a nuclear weapon at the other person, it is whether it's a tactical or a strategic, or I don't understand what high capacity, low capacity. It's a nuclear weapon, and as the country should respond as per the nuclear policy.
In fact, I'm going to come in a little later to talk about whether there's need to relook India's no first use policy, but that's just in a moment. Sushant, Sarin, as Air Marshal Khosla was pointing out, has India comprehensively called out Pakistan's nuclear bogey, punishing Pakistan not just in Balakot 2019, but Operation Sindoor in 2025, effectively also sending out a message that even before Pakistan can think of putting together its nuclear delivery mechanism in place, India will bomb it. That message goes out loud and clear?
Gaurav, I think part of the message goes around loud and clear that Pakistan cannot hide behind its nuclear shield and not expect any retaliation from India if it carries out acts of terror on Indian soil. So I think that message has gone across, which for the longest had not gone to Pakistan because they were hiding behind a nuclear umbrella. I think the latter part of your question, I would not be as cavalier as to think that message has also gone across, because I suspect, I have no evidence, it's only on, again, I was just telling you, don't take Donald Trump, what he says, seriously, but he's been saying it for about 50 or 60 times. When he talks about the possibility of a nuclear conflict, and you look at the events of May 10th, when we were hitting them very hard, what suddenly changed in the American calculation? Till the 9th of May, the Vice President of the United States was saying it's between Pakistan and India. The Americans don't need to enter this conflict. And suddenly on the 10th of May, there are alarm bells ringing. So what were the Pakistanis telling the Americans? Were they trying to threaten some kind of a nuclear conflagration? And if, for example, we start hitting them really hard, what are the options? Will they use or will they lose? So these are very serious questions, and I'm sure both the military planners as well as the strategic planners in India should take these into account. And it is in the light of whatever conclusions you reach that you might need to reevaluate and reassess your no first use posture. Although I think we have raised a bit of a question mark around it in
Okay.
previous pronouncements by different ministers and officials, including a former prime minister who once said that if Pakistanis think that we'll wait until they launch on us before we retaliate, they have another thought coming. You have Manohar
Yes.
Parrikar saying certain things when he was the
Yes.
Raksha Mantri. So you've had those statements, but has that been operationalized? Have the doctrines changed? And have the systems been put in place for a no first to junk the no first use and go in for a preemption strategy? Uh, Again, I don't have any answers to this. I'm not privy to anything official, but that
Okay.
is the sense I can make from whatever is there in the public domain.
Glenn Carl, whatever Russia is doing right now, whatever China is doing or not doing, adding 100 warheads to its inventory every year, is it resulting in President Trump thinking that he needs to step up? And do we need, okay, give me a moment as we try and reestablish this link with Glenn Carl. We just seem to have lost him. Sandeep, reports in the US suggest that these are, some kind of subcritical tests that are happening. In the India-Pakistan context, Sandeep, are we looking at, look, we have a stated no first use policy, and it was reiterated very recently that India is a very responsible nuclear weapons state. But considering what Manohar Parrikar seemed to indicate, that if there is a chemical attack on India or a biological attack on India, India may respond. Is India bringing a little bit of strategic ambiguity that if India knows that there will be a nuclear attack, there would be a preemptive strike?
Well, Gaurav, I tend to agree with what Sushant said, that while there might have been statements like this, I was there in that room when Manohar Parrikar made that statement at the IDSA, an institute that's now. The bulk of, there has been nothing to suggest that India has revised it's no first use stance. And in fact, the statements that come out of the Indian establishment about nuclear weapons and NFU, that they can be counted on the fingers of one hand. So it's safe to assume that there has been no revision of our NFU status, and there's been no such debate as of now. There have been these one or two odd statements, but apart from that, there's nothing to suggest that we have revised our thing based on any other, whatever external factors are at play, whether it is the rising number of weapons in the Chinese arsenal or in the Pakistani arsenal. I mean, there is possibly going to be a time when we will have to take a call on that, because the numbers then become overwhelming, and you're looking at a very different scenario faced with two of these nuclear weapons. But as of now, Gaurav, it doesn't seem like there's any debate in the at all about revising.
Glenn Carl, do you see a nuclear arms race being triggered by these statements, or this is just a flash in the pan? It's a statement that he's made and it'll be back to normal in the next couple of days?
I don't think either one is really the case. The arms race, the nuclear arms race, has really been returning slowly for a period of 10 years or 15 years even. That's why I think, surprisingly, for I think many of us, what Donald Trump has said is actually in line, fuzzy as it is, as all of our colleagues have said. Not only does he not necessarily know what he's talking about or intend what he's saying, but he really has only the most superficial understanding of what he's trying to say. However, it goes back to the Bush administration when the nuclear dynamics started to significantly shift with the lapse of test ban treaties and or intermediate nuclear force agreements and so on, and known cheating by the Russians, combined with now for a dozen years or so, a much more aggressive China with regard to nuclear weapons development and policy, with Pakistan and North Korea's developments. The world is a much different place than was the situation when you had a bipolar series of agreements and dynamic on nuclear issues. So what Trump has said is in line with the slow shifting of the United States to respond to this change in dynamic. By continuing to adhere to the nuclear agreements with Russia, the former Soviet Union, to which China is not a signatory, the United States has been hamstrung in developing new technologies and actually even in maintaining the capabilities of its nuclear force. So Trump's statement is in line with that things are changing, and this is in a sense, a way of freeing up or signaling that the United States will not be constrained anymore in responding to this changed dynamic. So surprisingly, Trump's statement, incoherent and confusing as it is typically, is in line with the changing international dynamic and 15 years of U.S. slow response to this changing dynamic.
So Daniel Silverberg, all this talk of disarmament, all the disarmament effort, clearly on the back burner, but is this not counterproductive? Donald Trump he likes to be seen as a man of peace, like a deal maker, someone who's stopping, as he claims, 8 wars. Except Thailand and Cambodia, wars are still raging. So are tensions. Does it not take away from his image of a man of a deal maker and a man of peace?
I think your audience is going to see Trump however they want to see him. The same thing in the United States, Gaurav. As the other panelists said, Mr. Trump is going to be saying all kinds of things, some which people love and others that will lead to a lot of rage. I want to point out this. I think the previous speaker hit on a really important point. I think Donald Trump was trying to signal something here to the Chinese. The timing was not accidental. I think what he was trying to signal is, we recognize that you are actively making advancements in your nuclear arsenal, China. We are not going to stand idly by while that happens. Now, the way he expressed that might have been in classic fashion, a little bit more chaotic and disjointed than one might want. But that is a position that both the Biden administration, even the Obama administration, and certainly the Trump administration have embraced. And even Congress, for the last 10 years, has funded both nuclear tests to the extent that involves making sure that the equipment is sound, and funded things like the Sentinel program. The US remains committed to the nuclear triad. That is not changing. Congress continues to fund it. There's nothing new about the US nuclear position. What could be different is whether one believes Mr. Trump is going to actually start nuclear tests. And I just don't think so.
Yep. But there is a change, and the signal was very clearly to China. The timing, as you rightly pointed out, was just before he met President Xi Jinping. In the light of what's happening around the world, Air Marshal Khosla, and since you are Vice Chief, is it time for India to relook its no first use policy? Officially, even very recently, India made it very clear we are a very responsible nuclear weapons state. We have a clear no first use policy. But whether it's former Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar or some others, they seem to have indicated, is there a need to bring in strategic ambiguity?
Yeah, definitely. And my reply is not because I was Vice Chief. This is my personal view and nothing to do with the efforts of the government of India, obviously. We have been counted as a very responsible state that we don't do nuclear saber rattling and all sort of things like Pakistan. But I have my personal opinion is that we have nuclear weapons. We don't have to do saber rattling as such, but we can always unsheath the saber, polish it and maybe put it back. And that will suffice to give some signals. In major power like Russia has done it when Ukraine war, they put their nuclear weapons and the nuclear apparatus into high alert and done exercises indicating, the use of nuclear weapons in case need be. So I think there is a time has come when we can, resort to some sort of a nuclear signaling.
Because Russia has signaled that. Russia has carried out those tests, except China and India. No other country has a no first use policy. Sushant, Sarin, you wanted to come in? Quick 30 seconds, sir.
Yeah, look, there are two things out here. One, yes, we've been very responsible. We have not indulged in nuclear saber rattling. But I wonder sometimes, has that compromised our nuclear deterrence? Because, a lot of things we don't do because the other side is a nuclear weapons power. So we don't want to, upset the strategic stability. That does not stop the other power from doing it. So has there been some gap in the kind of signaling we have been doing? Secondly, I think you have to look at a possibility when you're talking about a two-front situation, Gaurav, and two nuclear-armed states in China and the Pakistanis acting in concert against India. There is always that possibility. At what point do you decide that you need to start resorting to nuclear weapons for your own security and for your own defense? At what point? I think these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. It is one thing to say NFU against a non-nuclear state or a smaller state which does not have any military heft. It's quite another when you're looking at a two-front situation and significant territorial or other damage being inflicted on you because both those states are inimical and acting in concert. So I think these are things that will need to be worked out rather than, stay by that old mantra that was given 30 years back of no first use and just stick to it as though it's some kind of gospel which cannot be changed. I think it's a dynamic situation and we need to make policy and strategy in a dynamic manner rather than,
let the other person feel nervous. Let the other person feel nervous about what India may do next. Bring that strategic ambiguity on how we will respond. Some of it is coming in because now India's neighbors are nervous about how India will respond to terror and so many other aspects. But do we need to be a little more aggressive in our stance? That's a debate for another time. I want to thank our guests for joining me on this part of the debate.